that example that Cuba set, spread all over Latin America, all over the Caribbean. Young revolutionaries from across the region took up arms trying to follow the Cuban model, and we'll talk about them in a moment. But like with Haiti at the dawn of the previous century, that revolutionary example terrified um, people, in the halls of power in Washington. And at this particular point, we're talking about the early 60s now, during the Kennedy administration, the objective of US foreign policy, particularly toward Cuba and Latin America in general, was to prevent more Cuban revolutions, to prevent more radical transformations of power. And the Kennedy administration, beginning of 1960, uh, proposed what they called their Alliance for Progress. And like with the good neighbor policy in the first half of the 20th century, what we start to see in the early to mid 1960s is the United States trying to put a friendlier face on its foreign policy toward the region. Um, there was really no, they made no bones about this, right? The Kennedy administration wanted to prevent more insurgencies, armed revolutionary radical movements from popping up all over the hemisphere. So the Kennedy administration felt that, well, maybe one of the ways to do this is to try and enact very limited, through our allies in the region, friendly governments in Latin America, they can isolate Cuba by enacting little bits of land reform here or there. The United States would invest in infrastructure and take a friendlier approach to sort of the poor in these countries, all at the same time bolstering Latin American conservative militaries that could wage counterinsurgency strategies against these budding revolutionaries, but at the same time also offer a carrot to the public. I think it's a very interesting time period because the United States, this is sort of like the good neighbor policy 2.0, right? The Kennedy administration wants to forestall and prevent radical revolutions by sort of giving a carrot to Latin American governments to sort of trickle down to the public. And this is, the dual nature of the Alliance for Progress can be seen in the fact that the same time, the Kennedy administration gives birth to the Peace Corps, right? Where idealistic North Americans could, travel in brigades to friendly countries to help with infrastructure, to help with education, with medical care. This is also the era in which the United States invests heavily in the CIA and in the United States Special Forces to be able to wage counterinsurgency war, counterinsurgencies at the same time, right? There's the ultimate carrot and the stick. And the Alliance for Progress was quite successful in a number of places. In Central America, in particular, one of them was particularly El Salvador. But in other places, this was rejected as a friendlier version of imperialism, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. But what this does between the Cuban Revolution and as it radicalizes and becomes closer to the Soviet Union and Kennedy's Alliance for Progress in an attempt to forestall radical revolutions, what this does is it inserts the Latin America question into the middle of the Cold War, right? Latin America becomes a Cold War hotspot. And I want to stress that, very often, if we are lucky enough in our classrooms to learn anything about this subject, it's always sort of couched in the terms of the Cold War. But these were things that were going on long before. I mean, if we take anything away from this presentation, I hope that this is a longer story that both predates and survives well beyond the Cold War. But this now we have to reckon with the Cold War for the rest of the material we are going to cover today, because it certainly tempers the rhetoric of both revolutionaries and US foreign policy. I also want to make a note of the fact that it is still a myth that is taught pretty regularly in classrooms that because of the Cold War, because of these Cold War dynamics, that countries like Cuba, who had relations with the Soviet Union and were on a more radicalized political trajectory, that they became surrogates, that they became satellites of the Soviet Union. And I really want to take this opportunity to push against that. Remember, one of the major themes for our purposes tonight is talking about not just US intervention in Latin America, but the alternatives proposed by revolutionaries and by both by non-state actors as well as state actors in Latin America. And so while as the 60s progress, while this era progresses, the Cubans become more and more economically dependent upon the Soviet Union. They are constantly trying to assert political independence from them. I can think of no better case that demonstrates this than the Tricontinental Conference that was held in 1966 in Havana, in which Cuba invited. This was a really unprecedented. This was a really unprecedented meeting. Cuba invited representatives of leftist revolutionary movements from all over the world. It was this really wild event in which Cuban revolutionaries were meeting with members of the Viet Cong. They were meeting with the Sandinistas from Nicaragua, from the Palestinian Liberation Organization, from the Black Panther Party. Revolutionaries from all over the world were represented. And the idea was to turn the old saying from the Wilson administration during World War I, which was to make the world safe for democracy. At the Tricontinental Conference, these folks tried to make the world safe for revolution. The idea was to complicate the bipolar world of the Cold War and establish what we call South-South cooperation, a dynamic where these various revolutionary movements could be aided by other progressive regimes across the developing world as a way to balance out, to provide a radical third way to either the United States' interventions or the Soviet version of communism. So there's this really radical moment. This really is meant to insert Latin America and Latin American revolutionaries into the worldwide, 1960s radical era and the era of decolonization in places like Africa and Asia. I want to reiterate, like I said a little bit earlier, that the United States, their foreign policy, went from going to destroy the Cuban Revolution in the early 60s, particularly, in 1961 with the Bay of Pigs invasion, later during the Cuban Missile Crisis. The idea was the Cuban Revolution was consolidating itself, so it would be a better strategy to prevent more Cubas, to isolate Cuba by preventing these revolutionary experiments elsewhere. And they took action to do, not just through the CIA, not through just through the Alliance for Progress, but they also resurrected that old, the old brute force tactics of deploying the United States military. In 1965, the U.S. Marines were sent to occupy the Dominican Republic to prevent a popular leftist revolutionary upsurge. We very rarely hear about this. We very rarely talk about this, that in the year that the Vietnam War, that the then Johnson administration was ramping up the Vietnam War and deploying tens and later hundreds of thousands of U.S. combat troops to Southeast Asia, they still made room to send thousands of Marines into the Dominican Republic to prevent a popular revolution. And this is something that Dominicans very much were traumatized by. And recall, this is something that we in North America, we have forgotten. But once again, we have this dynamic of the carrot and the stick, the back and the forth, the United States intervening to prevent revolutionary examples from spreading around the hemisphere. The 1960s and the 1970s, certainly into the 1980s, becomes the era of the guerrilla insurgency in Latin America. You would be hard pressed to find a country in the region that didn't experience some form of armed struggle in this era. An entire generation, almost two, of young progressives tried to emulate Che Guevara and these other revolutionaries in Cuba by attempting to overthrow their corrupt and often brutal military dictatorships backed by the United States through an armed struggle. We're going to talk a little bit about a few of these in a moment, but it is important to note that, with the exception of Cuba and later Nicaragua in 1979, there's very few of these armed rebellions were successful. It is important to note that a generation of young people really did sacrifice quite a lot in their attempts to recreate the Cuban model. And this is not, I don't say that as, a way of kind of minimalizing them and calling them dreamers. I mean, these were people who saw that these things were possible. And it is important to note that within each of these societies, in El Salvador, in Nicaragua, in Uruguay, in Colombia, in Venezuela, in Argentina, in these places where these guerrilla insurgencies took place, there is a memory of these young people who took it upon themselves to resist, to fight back, all with the philosophy of stating that another world is possible. It's really important to remember that.